Thank you both, Senators, for making time. So every Wednesday morning, you meet to discuss religious issues and to pray. How did this start?
It actually started in the 1950s, actually. The Senate's done this every Wednesday for decades now. And it's not just discussing religious issues, it's talking about our own personal faith. Every Wednesday morning, bipartisan group of senators, usually about 15 to 25, depending week to week on the folks that can get there. We'll get together. One senator will stand up, tell their story, their own spiritual journey, something that's happening in their life. We'll share prayer requests with each other. We'll pray together. The person who's speaking will also pick a hymn and we'll sing a song together of their choosing. And then at the end, we literally all hold hands and pray for each other and pray for the nation, and we're dismissed. It's about an hour together very early on a Wednesday just to be able to gather and have normal conversation.
You know, for most people, they sit down at the table at holidays, and the two things that are supposed to be forbidden are talking politics and talking religion. Mm-hmm. And here, in this place of contentiousness,
we managed to bring those together every
You're bringing
Wednesday
them together
morning.
in a positive way.
Right.
Yeah. We try.
In this political climate, has it hurt attendance or has it driven up attendance?
I think it's driven up attendance, frankly. We have a fluid group that includes a fairly broad range of both caucuses. I think the average American would be surprised and frankly encouraged if they knew just how many senators have come through this weekly prayer breakfast in their time in the Senate. There's other groups that are just one party that do Bible study together or breakfast together. But this roughly 24 senators week in and week out is a little bit of an oasis away from the constant pressure of the press, lobbyists, staff, other meetings. An awful lot of what we focus on is our families, our personal concerns, and then sharing stories that are vulnerable, personal, and meaningful. It's a way to really get to know each other. I found it the most powerful and ultimately meaningful way to get to know other senators in my time here.
And you're both prayer leaders in the group, is that right?
Well, have been. Yeah, we actually chaired the prayer breakfast for 2 years before we've now handed that off to two other senators that are now chairing that, one Democrat, one Republican. That's the way it's been for decades and decades. It's a moment for people to be able to talk about their faith, something that's deeply personal in everyone's journey, but it's also very important. You don't really understand who someone is until you reach the point you can really learn about their faith and their own personal journey with faith. Then you start learning more than just their name and the names of their children and their background. You really learn what's important to someone and how they're struggling with their own faith.
So what's unique about the two of you, though, when I was looking at your biographies, besides being a Democrat and a Republican, you both studied divinity in one form or the other.
Correct. Right.
So your faith and sort of your moral foundation has always been part of your consciousness in forming your political beliefs, is that right?
My faith has inspired and informed an awful lot of what I've done, whether it was service work overseas or engagement in social causes at home. But one of the challenges, I think, of our service and our time here is to strengthen and sustain our faith, even at a time when the political conclusions that people reach from that faith can lead us to have such sharply different views on the role of government, society, on the role of individual liberty, on what sorts of rights we think are most central. One of the great things about having a weekly prayer breakfast is we are not getting together to argue about the issues that are so often used to divide people based on faith. We're not sitting there arguing about gay marriage and abortion and the death penalty. We're frankly sitting there praying with and for each other, singing hymns, talking about our families, and then sharing some stories about how did I get into public service and how am I sustaining it? And hearing that from other friends, from other colleagues, is an incredible window into them. Look, in a world where we've all, those of us who are up for re-election, we've got trackers, people who literally record us every minute of every day. The halls here are full of wonderful journalists who ask pointed and pressing questions, and we're in a very sharply divided partisan moment. It is hard to find any space here to be vulnerable, to admit that we don't have all the answers, to admit any sort of lack of certainty or confidence in our party's political views, and having a conversation that starts around the most basic questions. Why are we here? What is it we're trying to do? Whose are we? Why were we made? What role are we trying to play in society? Having a conversation about those very basic questions rather than a fight about the end point, the application through law, is a good way to have a conversation in a place where we so rarely do that.
Yeah. Faith is exceptionally important to people that live their faith. And what I challenge people is, if you're a person of faith, live your faith. Whether you're elected in politics, whether you're at work, whether you're at home, whatever it may be, you can live your faith. Faith should impact who you are. If your faith only affects your weekends, that's not a faith, that's a hobby. A hobby is something you do on weekends. A faith is something that permeates everything you do. And so when I was elected, when Chris was elected, we weren't elected and said, okay, now go there, now you have to take your faith off when you go. It's still who you are and a part of who I am. So I think it's important, whether it's volunteering at a homeless shelter or working on a habitat build or being up here and praying through issues or being able to work on things or the way I treat other people. Our faith, and my faith in particular, has the strong belief that people are created in the image of God and they have value and worth. That means people that I disagree with, I should be able to disagree with them in a way that still respects them as a person. That changes the way that I debate, that changes the way that I engage on issues because of my own personal faith.
Do you think, listening to you now, it makes me think though, has partisanship become ideological? I mean, people associate political parties right now with a fundamental moral judgment of whether you're a good or bad person.
Right. And that's a bad place to be. We should not identify political parties based on a particular faith or a particular faith tradition. Because a political party is not about a faith. Now, you can be a person of faith and be in a political party, but political parties don't own certain faith traditions, nor should they. And quite frankly, it's toxic for any faith to say that if you're one of those in that faith, then you're also one of those in that political party. That's a bad environment, because you have in any political party, you have people that both live a faith and do not live a faith. And that's up to them. I mean, that's a personal choice for any individual. And it's the joy of being an American, that we actually have the ability to have any faith of our choosing or have no faith at all and still be active in our national politics and still be a great citizen of our country.
And I think one of our challenges as people who did study faith and did practice it in our life before being elected is to strike that balance where we are elected officials and thus represent big states with a wide and robust range of people of different views, either people of one of the main Abrahamic faiths, the Muslims or Jews or Christians, or people who have no faith tradition at all but are still entitled to be adequately and well and thoroughly represented. We have to balance being part of that broad, wide open society with our own personal faith. I came to Washington intending not to hide the values that inform my interest in public service, but also not to impose them. So if there is something that I think is core to everybody who gathers at this prayer breakfast, it's an interest in kindness, in humility, in patience, and to listening to each other. That may be something that is rare here in Washington, but frankly, that's one of the attractions of spending at least 1 hour a week together, where we sort of put the tools down and stop trying to hit each other so much.
Exactly what you just laid out. I mean, there are going to be people at home who are rolling their eyes saying,
They're welcome
this
to.
is called the swamp for a reason,
Right.
and that there is no moral high ground left here. You're about to enter an even more contentious period of time.
Right.
I'm not even talking about the election. I'm just talking about the Senate trial
Right.
following the expected impeachment of the president. Can you even talk about that?
It is genuinely straining. Some of the friendships I've worked hard to build over the last decade across the aisle, to be in a time when we have such sharply divided politics. I've got a number of friends who I work really well with. We legislate all the time, we've traveled together, we've worked together, but on certain issues and on certain topics, we can barely speak about it anymore. That just reflects what's happening in our home states. Frankly, in some of our families. My hunch is that Thanksgiving, that the whole holiday season this year was an occasion for lots of folks to gather with extended families that represent the whole range of American views. What we really need to do here in Washington, I think, is model the ability to disagree with each other, but not be cruel or sharp or nasty to each other. The whole reason we have a Congress is to resolve disputes without resorting to violence, so that people who come from very different states and from very different frameworks and very different values can come together here and resolve things. We are underperforming in that area right now in the Congress. We are reflecting the deep divisions that exist in our country. But I think a part of why we come here, and at least a part of why I gather with my colleagues across the aisle 1 hour a week, is to try and be open to working across the aisle, because I don't know how else we fix this. I don't know how else we're going to move forward other than respecting each other and getting to know each other across these deep and significant divisions.
Yeah, Washington, D.C. really is a mirror to the rest of the country. Sometimes the country doesn't want to admit it, but the divisions that are in Washington, D.C. are present all over the country right now. And what you see in your neighborhood, in your community, in your own church or synagogue or gathering places, what you see there and all the differences, you also see in Washington, D.C. And so the way America changes Washington, D.C. is really America looks at ourselves and our own families and our own communities and our own neighborhoods. As we change as individuals, how we speak to each other, Washington, D.C. follows that. But D.C. doesn't often lead that. D.C. often follows that. And so that one of the key things that we can do is just be who we are. There are people of faith scattered all around the country. There are people that don't have a faith all around the country. But we can show respect to each other and to say, go live your faith. Whatever that faith chooses to be, I'm going to live mine, and we're going to find a way to be able to work together, even in areas where we disagree, and find areas of common ground. I don't have to compromise my values to find areas of common ground.
I want to ask you about some of those questions of values, because you have different moral convictions in terms of where you've landed on some very hot button issues, abortion being one of them, LGBTQ rights, another one. But then you have found common ground on things like giving safe haven to refugees.
Yes.
Neither of you liked President Trump's cap on the number of refugees being allowed into this country. Senator Lankford, you opposed child separation.
I do.
In opposition to the president's policy at that time. You've both supported some limited restrictions on gun purchases as well. Is there a lesson in these narrow portions of agreement for your parties? I mean, why aren't your parties reflecting more of what you're explaining here?
Very, very often is because parties and interest groups and other things push people apart and say, don't you dare go talk to XYZ or go work on solutions. There's much of the infrastructure of Washington, D.C. is based on not finding a solution, it's prolonging the problem. And so anytime there's a discussion about immigration, for instance, there's a whole group of folks that have a cottage industry on maintaining their perspective on immigration and never moving on any issue. And so you get into protracted conversations of how do you solve this? Well, we could sit down and be able to solve it together, but it's gathering a coalition of 60 people that all agree this is the right solution, the right way to do it. I often come back to the simple principle. There is common ground. On almost every hard issue, there's common ground between that. And what Washington has become is not a place of finding the common ground. It's, okay, you've got to give into something you really hate, and I'll get into something that I really hate, and then we'll have a compromise bill. That fails every time. We've got to start with the basics. What do we both agree on? Let's do a smaller bill on the areas where we agree on and move on some of these things rather than just shouting on the things we disagree on.
Incremental change?
I was really encouraged when I went to James after President Trump announced a likely reduction in the number of refugees admitted to the United States. And his response was immediate and positive and said, let's find a way to craft some common language and then go talk to our colleagues. I think we ended up with a dozen senators of both parties saying this country has a long tradition of welcoming refugees. It's rooted in, frankly, every major faith tradition, and most of the refugee-serving organizations in our country are faith-based organizations. This is an environment where relatively few Republicans are publicly pushing back or disagreeing with the president on anything. And one of the things I've come to really respect about James is his very thoughtful approach to the issues where he says, you know, I support the president, I'm a Republican, but on this, I'll disagree. And I'll disagree in a measured way and in a way that's principled and in a way that he can sustain. That began partly because we got to know each other through the prayer breakfast, but also because he was the chair and I was the ranking member of a very contentious and difficult subcommittee of appropriations. It's the Financial Services and General Government Subcommittee. Really boring. 14 different agencies and small, right? And my recollection in the 20-year history of that subcommittee, the bill from that subcommittee had never made it out of the Senate. The first time it happened was when James was chairing and I was the ranking. And I think more than anything else because we pushed each other and pushed our staff to listen and to be engaged in the details and to clear and resolve issues that folks had just kicked down the road for years and years and years.
Senator Lankford, I want to follow up on something there. You know, we're on the verge of this impeachment trial. And during the the Clinton impeachment, we often heard from Republicans the criticism and the call for an American president to be a moral leader. And we heard about moral failings. These days, you will quietly hear criticism of the president from Republicans, but you don't hear that loud criticism in the way we did 20 years ago. What has changed?
Yeah, I'm not sure anything has changed. I think there's still this ongoing conversation about policy and about responsible leadership and about role models. I said very early on in the campaign time period, when people asked me in 2016, what are you looking for? I said, well, I always look for a president who can be a role model. I don't think that President Trump as a person is a role model for a lot of different youth. That's just me personally. I don't like the way that he tweets. Some of the things that he says, his word choices at times are not my word choices. He comes across with more New York City swagger than I do from the Midwest, and definitely not the way that I'm raising my kids. Saying that, there are policy areas that we agree on. And when we agree on those things, we work on those things together. But it's also been a grand challenge to be able to say, for a person of faith, for a person who believes that there is a right way to go on things, I wish that he did, and he was more of a role model in those areas. Now, saying all that, on the area of life, where I'm very passionate about of the issues of abortion, for instance, he's been tenaciously pro-life. He's focused on putting people around him that are very, very focused on religious liberty, not honoring a particular faith, but honoring any person of any faith to go be able to live and practice that faith and to have respect for that. That's helpful for any person of faith, to be able to say, give me the space to be able to live my faith and to be able to put people into the administration that will also allow that and encourage that. So for people of faith, it's a bit of a conundrum at times, that I look at some of the moral decisions that he's made and go, I disagree with that. But he's also been very, very protective of areas like life and very protective of areas of religious liberty to be able to allow people to be able to live their faith out. And at the end of the day, what we're really looking for in an administration is folks that allow us to be able to live our principles.
Has that been hard for you? As a person who talks about living his faith, is it hard for you at times?
It is not hard for me to be able to live that out, because my first responsibility is for myself and for my family.
But then you get asked by people like me,
That's
how
correct.
could you support this?
So
how could you support that?
It is the most interesting question that I get almost every day when I walk through anywhere in the Capitol. Someone from the press will say, the president just tweeted out this, what do you think about it? And put it in a microphone in my face and say, answer for any kind of moral statement. Or he just said a curse word in a public setting. I know you're a person of faith, go answer for this. Again, the president has a spokesperson, and I'm not the president's spokesperson. I have a responsibility for myself and my team and for what my family is going to do. And then I'm also going to try to set what I believe is the right role model. Everyone has a task here. And one of the interesting things about Washington, D.C. is I don't get to pick the people that I work with. The American people pick the people that I work with. And then my responsibility is to be able to get things done in that environment that I think drive home a set of values and a set of policies that help the nation long term.
Senator Coons, I read that both you and the president are Presbyterian and have found some commonality there, but that you had kind of an awkward interaction with him once where he personally challenged you on the Democratic Party's support for abortion rights.
We've had
What
a
was
number.
that like?
We've had a number of sharp exchanges, and you know, the president's been a real challenge for me to find ways to work with. I'll tell you that praying for the president is probably one of the greatest spiritual challenges I've had to work through in my life. I was raised to pray for those in positions of authority, the senators and governors and congressmen and president. And President Trump and I have very different views about some core issues. We've had a conversation about his treatment of refugees and his blocking folks from coming to our country and the so-called Muslim ban that he enacted right when he was elected. And we've also had a conversation about abortion and reproductive rights. And I think we vigorously disagree on both. What we haven't had is the time to really have a thoughtful conversation. One of the things I respect about James is when we were both invited to go to the White House. Was this a year ago now?
It was a year ago.
And I frankly said, I'm not sure I see the point. He encouraged me to be hopeful and to keep an open heart and to believe in the possibility of a positive and meaningful conversation. So far, I haven't made as much progress in that direction as I might have hoped. But part of the point of being a person who believes in the potential of everybody to change and to grow is that I live in a very challenging time in a challenging environment, and I hope that I can be a good model of what it means to believe deeply in certain principles and yet respect others, others who are my colleagues who believe equally deeply in an opposite application of that same principle.
I mean, God obviously doesn't have a political party, but
Right.
there is this perception, particularly in messaging, that the conservative movement almost has an ownership of it. And you've heard this on the campaign trail. Some Democrats call for the Democratic Party to be more open about talking about faith. I mean, what you're doing, though, is kind of unusual to speak this openly.
One of the things that's been striking to me about this exact presidential primary season is how a wide range of my party's candidates, Mayor Pete, Mayor Buttigieg of South Bend, Indiana, talks comfortably and frequently about the faith he was raised in and how his faith motivates him to service. Elizabeth Warren's talked about teaching Sunday school. Joe Biden is someone who has endured some of the greatest tragedies I can imagine as a parent through his deep faith and the way in which that helps to refresh him. Both Amy Klobuchar and Kirsten Gillibrand have been regular participants in the weekly prayer breakfast and have spoken about that on the trail. There is a perception in the country that the Democratic Party somehow is disrespectful of people of faith and people trying to live their lives in faith. And I would say actually the opposite, that most of my colleagues who came here as members of the Democratic Party were strongly motivated by a passion for the marginalized, the oppressed, those who are at the edges of our society, and for justice and for making changes in how our society is structured that would actually make it a more inclusive and tolerant and just society. And a lot of that, for a lot of my colleagues, that's rooted in either a Torah sense of righteousness or a gospel sense of justice. We don't talk about it as much.
Is that a mistake?
Well, I have urged Democrats where it's comfortable and appropriate to share with folks what motivates them, what got them into public service in the first place. But I'm also mindful that we don't want to be misperceived as saying this law only applies for or is only written for people of a particular faith, or this approach is dominated by this particular faith. I happen to be a Christian. There is no verse in our Gospels that says Jesus was a Republican, Jesus was a Democrat. In fact, pretty clearly not. And so trying to apply principles that come from thousands of years ago to a modern political environment is a challenging and fraught exercise for anyone. I think your first step ought to be humble. When you assert that you are confident that what Jesus would do in this circumstance is demand that you vote for this bill, everybody's got to have a little humility about how certain they are that they know that outcome. The issues that divided the church, the issues that divided the faith community 100 years ago are issues that none of us are talking about today. So in the grand scheme of things, one of the things that matters to me about the relationships I'm building with my colleagues is that we treat each other with respect, that we treat each other honorably, and that we do our best by the people who elected us. That matters as much as up or down on any particular appropriation bill or defense program or social justice initiative. I've got strong views about what I think is called for, but I know that James has, in some areas, equal and opposite views. We have to be able to discuss that, debate that, work with each other at times and against each other at times, and still have a respectful relationship. For too much of the country, that's become too difficult, and I think Democrats can help lead the way back to a common sense of purpose as a nation by sharing where we're coming from.
Is there, because I know we're out of time, but final question, is there a way back to bipartisanship? I mean, we talk about this being an incredibly heated, partisan, divided, contentious moment. Is this temporary? Is this what we need to get used to?
No, there is a way back, and it starts with people being able to acknowledge each other for just their humanity and in all their faults, and to be able to have real serious dialogue. The press loves talking about President Trump's faults and whatever it may be of the day or whatever they don't like about it. When we gather together and say, okay, let's find a way to be able to work together and be able to treat each other with respect and to be able to see what we can actually get done, it's remarkable what can actually be done. When everyone's pushing each other into a corner and saying you're one of those people and so I'm not going to talk to you, we will always have problems. And
So you're raising our expectations for this new year, Senator.
well,
Are we going to see
at the-
something big?
It's an election year that's by definition a more heated, divisive year. Those are decisions Americans make. And when you push people into a corner, whether it is by race or whether it's by faith or whether it's by political party or where you grew up, when you push people and say you're one of those, and so immediately I'm not going to spend time with you, I'm not going to try to learn you, I'm not going to try to ask hard questions or be vulnerable and to be able to solve problems with you, we're going to have problems as a country. And one of the challenges that we have right now is that when someone posts something on social media for either one of us, no matter what it is we post on social media, there's a whole group of people that will come on and blast us and say terrible, mean things. They don't know us, they don't know our background, they don't know the real issues. They're just angry, and the country as a whole is angry. And until you move past you're one of those people, so you're evil, we're not going to fix this in our families, in our communities, or certainly as a nation. So for people that just do not like the president and the way he does things or his policies, why don't we find areas where we can be able to work together, and we'll find areas of common ground. Democrats and Republicans being able to find areas of common ground. No matter what race, background, or faith that you have, we have areas of common ground. And right now we're focusing on what divides us rather than what unites us, and that will always be a problem for us.
So that means gun reform, something Americans agree there needs to be something in the new year?
I would tell you that Chris and I actually have a bill that we've worked on that issue.
What about Violence Against Women Act? Why hasn't the Senate acted on that?
So there are two different versions against the Violence Against Women Act right now, a Republican version and a Democrat version. And if there was real conversation to be able to sit down, those two would be merged, and that would have already been long past.
What about immigration? Are you optimistic in the new year?
We had lots of conversations on immigration. Chris and I have lots of conversations on immigration. Again, if we had a deadline in a moment to resolve immigration, we would solve it. We really thought it was a year and a half ago when there was the initial deadline to say it has to be done by February of 2018. That was a moment we had 4 different bills, and we thought we'd get it resolved. Instead, the court took it and said, let the court be able to decide this. The court will eventually pass it back to the legislative branch and to say, okay, we've done what we do, we'll pass it back to you, and we'll have a new deadline. There's a framework for solving immigration that's a bipartisan deadline, and it would shock people to know that I believe the president really does want to solve the immigration issue. He and his team have been very engaged in it, and for all the folks that say he's hardcore opposed to anything in immigration, look at some of the proposals that he's actually put out and the way that he actually wants to be able to resolve it. And I think if we can get a deadline and say we're going to resolve it by then and push Congress and the White House to get it resolved, we can.
Here's the striking thing. James and I come from very different political, religious, cultural contexts, right? I'm a progressive, he's a conservative. I'm from the East Coast, he's from the heartland. We come from different religious traditions and faith perspectives. We have co-sponsored bills together on tax, trade, immigration, guns, I mean, a dozen different things. And he's taking on the challenge in the next year of being the chair of the Senate Ethics Committee. I'll be the ranking member. It is the only committee of Congress that is equally divided, Republicans and Democrats, and where we can only act with a bipartisan vote. I am optimistic that we'll be able to continue the bipartisan tradition of the Ethics Committee that Senator Isaacson and I established in the last Congress, but it is a hard undertaking to have that role here institutionally. And one of the things that gives me some optimism about the coming year is that in the middle of this incredibly divisive period, when the views of our president and his actions are either very strongly against or very strongly in favor, that James and I will keep putting in the time to listen to each other, to respect each other, and to put bills out together that will solve problems.
We wish you both luck. Thank you for your time.